I was staring at a market. Then she said my name, her voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. That was the moment I realized my grandmother had been dead for 7 days, and not a single person in my family had thought I deserved to know. How do you mourn someone who has been gone for a week without you? How do you process a loss that everyone else has already started moving past? But more importantly, how do you handle the realization that your own father, the man who brought you into this world, decided to bury his mother while keeping you in a state of intentional, calculated ignorance? The funeral is in less than 48 hours. I'm standing at a crossroads that feels more like a minefield. If I go, I have to face the man I've spent 5 years hiding from. If I don't, I let the last connection to my childhood die in a room full of people who treat me like a stranger. This isn't just about a funeral anymore. It's about whether I'm willing to let my past finally bury me along with her. It started out as such a mundane Tuesday. You know those days where nothing feels heavy? I was over at Sarah's place, drinking coffee that had gone cold, talking about nothing in particular. She had logged into her Facebook account for the first time in months. She's one of those people who deactivated everything to find inner peace, but she needed to check a listing on the marketplace for some furniture she wanted to flip. We were laughing about how expensive everything had become, just normal sibling banter. And then, the laugh just died. I watched her face go pale. I watched her scroll up, then down, then back up again, her eyes darting across the screen as if she was trying to translate a foreign language. I asked her what was wrong, thinking maybe she'd seen an ex or some drama with a friend. She didn't answer. She just handed me the phone. There, nestled between an advertisement for a local gym and a photo of someone's dinner, was a post from our Aunt Brenda. It was a photo of our grandmother, Nana, from a few years ago. She was smiling, holding a sunflower, looking exactly like the woman who used to bake us burnt cookies and tell us stories about the old country. The caption was short, flowery, and devastating. Heaven gained another angel a week ago. Rest in peace, Mom. Services will be held this weekend for family and friends. A week ago, the words felt like a physical blow to the chest. I felt the air leave my lungs. My first instinct wasn't even sadness. It was confusion. I looked at my own phone, sitting innocently on the coffee table. No missed calls, no unread texts, no voicemails from my father, my aunts, or my cousins. Nothing. For 7 days, the world had been different. A piece of our history had been erased, and we were living in a bubble of silence that our family had carefully constructed around us. Maybe it's a mistake, Sarah whispered, though we both knew it wasn't. Brenda wasn't the type to post something like that for attention. With shaking hands, I opened a browser on my phone and typed in Nana's name, followed by the word obituary. I hit search, and there it was. A local funeral home's website. A black and white photo. Her full name. Her dates of birth and death. The date of death was exactly 7 days ago. The obituary listed her survivors. It mentioned her children, my father and my aunts. It mentioned her beloved grandchildren, but it didn't list our names. It was as if we didn't exist. We were the other grandchildren, the ones relegated to a nameless collective, or perhaps, in their minds, we weren't even that. The silence in the room became deafening. You could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car horn outside, the ticking of a clock on the wall that suddenly seemed to be counting down to something inevitable. I looked at Sarah, and I saw the same reflection of hurt and rage that I knew was etched on my own face. To understand why this hit so hard, you have to understand our father. Calling our relationship strained is like calling a hurricane a light breeze. My father is a man who uses silence as a weapon and words as a scalpel. He was emotionally abusive in a way that's hard to explain to people who haven't lived it. It wasn't always shouting. Sometimes it was the way he'd look through you, like you were made of glass. It was the way he'd withhold affection to punish you for things you didn't even know you'd done. I went no contact with him 5 years ago. It was the hardest and best decision I ever made. I walked away to save my own sanity, to build a life where I didn't wake up wondering which version of him I was going to get that day. I haven't seen his face, heard his voice, or stepped foot in his house in half a decade. Sarah, bless her heart, is different. She's the peacemaker. She's the one who still sends the Happy Thanksgiving and Merry Christmas texts, even when they go unreturned or are met with a one-word reply. She tries to keep a bridge open, even if she's the only one maintaining the planks. And yet, despite her efforts, despite her being the good daughter who stayed reachable, he didn't call her. He let her find out from a social media post by an aunt we haven't spoken to in years. He didn't even tell you, I said, my voice cracking. Sarah shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. I texted him on Sunday, just to tell him I hoped he was having a good weekend. He replied, thanks. That was it. Nana was already dead for 4 days at that point, and he just said thanks. That realization that he had engaged with her, had her name pop up on his screen, and consciously chose to withhold the news of his own mother's death was a new level of cruelty. It wasn't just an oversight. It wasn't that he forgot in his grief. It was a deliberate exclusion. It was his way of saying, you are no longer part of this family. You don't get to grieve with us. I felt a coldness settling into my bones. Nana wasn't perfect, but she was our Nana. She was the one who hid us in the kitchen when Dad was in one of his moods. She was the one who smelled like peppermint and old books. And now, she was gone. And the gatekeeper to her final goodbye was the very man I had spent 5 years trying to forget. The obituary had the dates and times. The wake is this Friday, the funeral is Saturday morning. The clock is ticking, and every second that passes feels like a choice I'm being forced to make. I called my mom. My parents have been divorced for over a decade, and she knows the monster my father can be better than anyone. I told her what we found. I expected her to be angry on our behalf, but instead, she was quiet. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with a kind of weary resignation. If they didn't tell you, she said, then you aren't invited. Going there is only going to bring you pain. He's waiting for a reason to hurt you again, and you're handing it to him on a silver platter if you show up at that funeral home. Her words hit me like a bucket of ice water. She wasn't wrong. My father thrives on control, and by showing up uninvited, I'd be walking right back into his theater of operations. But then I looked at Sarah. She was clutching a tissue, her face red and puffed. I don't care about him, Sarah whispered. I want to say goodbye to Nana. She's my grandmother too. Why does he get to decide if I get to say goodbye? And that's the question that's been looping in my head ever since. Does he get to own the grief? Does he get to own the memory of a woman who loved us? I am torn down the middle. One half of me is terrified, the little girl inside who still flinches at the sound of a heavy footstep, and she's screaming at me to stay away, to protect the peace I've spent 5 years building. But the other half, the woman I've become, is furious. She's tired of being erased. She wants to stand in that room, look him in the eye, and let him know that he doesn't have the power to delete us from the family history. But as I look at the black and white photo of Nana on my screen, I have to ask myself, is saying goodbye worth the war that's about to break out? The night after we found the obituary was the longest night of my life. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I didn't see Nana. I saw my father's face. I saw that specific, tight-lipped expression he'd get right before he'd systematically dismantle your self-esteem. It's a look that haunts you, even 5 years and several hundred miles away. I kept thinking about the word no contact. It sounds so clean, doesn't it? Like you've just unplugged a lamp and the light went out. But it's not like that. No contact is a constant, daily choice to keep a door bolted shut while someone on the other side is still breathing, still existing, and still capable of hurting you from a distance. I sat in the dark of my living room, the glow from my laptop the only light. I found myself looking at old photos, physical ones I'd kept in a shoebox at the back of my closet. There was one of Nana holding me when I was about 6. She was wearing a floral apron, her hair perfectly coiffed in that 1950s style she never gave up. She looked tired, but kind. Nana wasn't a saint. She had her own flaws, her own ways of looking the other way when my father's temper flared. But she was the closest thing to a safety net we had. She was the one who would slip us $5 bills and tell us to buy something sweet. She was the one who, when my father would go on a 3-day silent treatment because I'd gotten a B in math, would call the house and ask to speak to me specifically, just to tell me she liked the drawing I'd sent her. She was a buffer, a soft landing in a very hard house. And the thought of her lying in a cold room somewhere, surrounded by people who had spent the last week keeping her death a secret from her own grandchildren, made my blood run cold. Sarah called me at 2 a.m. I knew she was awake. We've always had this twin-like intuition, even though we aren't twins. We share the same trauma, which is a bond stronger than blood. "I'm going," she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised me. Usually, Sarah is the one who wavers. "I've been thinking about it all night, and I'm going. I don't care if they look at me like I'm a ghost. I don't care if Dad makes a scene. I need to stand by that casket and tell her I love her one last time. If I don't go, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if she died thinking I didn't care." "Sarah, you know what he's like," I whispered, gripping the phone. "He's going to use this. He's going to make it about how disrespectful we are for showing up uninvited. He'll make a scene in front of everyone, or worse, he'll do that thing where he acts like he doesn't know who we are." "Let him," she snapped, and I could hear the tears finally breaking through. "Let him be the monster. I'm tired of being afraid of a man who hasn't even looked me in the eye in years. Nana deserves better than us staying away because of him." I didn't have an answer for that. She was right. Nana did deserve better. But I also knew the cost of being in my father's orbit. For 5 years, I had rebuilt myself. I had gone to therapy. I had learned how to breathe without checking the room for exits. I had finally stopped flinching when someone raised their voice. Going to that funeral meant walking back into the radiation zone. It meant exposing those new, fragile parts of myself to the very person who had tried to crush them in the first place. I thought back to the last time I saw him. It wasn't a big blow-up. It wasn't a cinematic shouting match. It was quiet. He had said something so cutting, so deeply personal about my character, that I realized in that moment he didn't actually love me. He loved the idea of owning me. And if he couldn't own me, he wanted to break me. I walked out of his house that day and never looked back. I blocked his number. I blocked his email. I told my aunts that if they wanted a relationship with me, it had to be separate from him. Clearly, they chose their side. My mind kept going back to the obituary. The omission of our names felt like a formal eviction. It was a legal document of our erasure. She is survived by her children and her grandchildren. It's a small phrase, but in the world of family politics, it's a declaration of war. By not listing us, they were telling the community, and us, that we were dead to them long before Nana ever took her last breath. Wednesday morning came with a heavy gray sky. I called my boss and told them I might need the end of the week off for a family emergency. They were sympathetic, asking if I needed anything. I felt like a fraud. How do you explain that your family emergency is a funeral you weren't told about for a woman you loved, overseen by a father you fear? I spent the afternoon on the phone with my mom again. She was more vocal this time. "You girls are looking for closure in a place where there is none," she said. She was sitting on her porch. I could hear the wind chimes in the background. "Your father has spent his whole life making sure everyone around him feels small. If you go to that funeral, you're giving him a stage. He'll play the grieving son, and he'll play the victim of ungrateful children who only showed up for the funeral. You can't win with him." "It's not about winning, Mom," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. "It's about Nana." "Is it?" she asked softly. "Or is it about proving you still exist?" That question stuck in my throat. Was I trying to honor my grandmother? Or was I trying to force my father to acknowledge the hole I'd left in his life? Was I going for her? Or was I going for me? I looked at my closet. I had a black dress. I'd bought it for a friend's wedding that had a dark formal theme, but now it looked like a shroud. I took it out and laid it on the bed. It looked small and lonely against the white duvet. If I go, I have to drive 3 hours. I have to stay in a hotel because there's no way I'm stepping foot in that house. I have to walk into a room filled with people who have spent a week whispering about why the girls aren't there. I have to face the judgmental stares of my aunts who think I'm difficult and dramatic for cutting off an abusive man. I have to endure the fake, "I'm so sorry for your loss," from people who didn't even bother to send a text. And then there's him. The thought of seeing him, seeing that smug, controlled mask he wears in public, makes my stomach churn. I can almost feel the weight of his gaze. He has this way of looking at you that makes you feel like you're 5 years old and you've just broken his favorite vase. It's a gaze that demands an apology for your very existence. Sarah sent me a text at 4 p.m. I booked a room at the Marriott near the funeral home. 2 beds. I'm going regardless, but I really don't want to do this alone. Please. That please was the anchor. Sarah has always been the one to stay, the one to try, the one to take the hits so they wouldn't land on me. When we were kids, she'd distract him when he was angry, drawing his fire away from me because she knew I was more sensitive. She'd spent her whole life being my shield, and now, for the first time, she was asking me to be hers. I looked at the black dress on the bed. I looked at the photo of Nana. I thought about the 7 days of silence. The 7 days she'd been gone while I was out buying groceries, watching movies, and living my life, completely unaware that the woman who helped raise me was being prepared for the earth. There is a specific kind of grief that comes with being excluded. It's not just the loss of the person, it's the loss of your right to mourn. It's the realization that your family has decided you don't belong to the story anymore. They've closed the book, and you're just a footnote they've decided to skip. I grabbed my phone and typed back to Sarah. "I'm coming. I'll be there by 7 p.m. on Friday. We're doing this together." As soon as I hit send, my heart started racing so fast I thought I might pass out. I felt like I just signed a contract with a demon. I was going back. I was breaking the silence. I was walking back into the storm, and I had no idea if I was strong enough to survive the fallout. The rest of the day was a blur of preparation. I packed a small bag. I made sure my car had gas. I checked the obituary one more time, memorizing the address of the funeral home. It's a place I've been to before, for my grandfather, years ago. I remember the smell of it, lilies and floor wax, the heavy, stifling silence of a room where people are pretending to be better than they are. As I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my packed suitcase, a new thought entered my mind. A thought that hadn't occurred to me until that moment. What if he doesn't just ignore us? What if he tries to kick us out? What if, in front of everyone, in front of Nana's casket, he decides to finish what he started 5 years ago and finally, publicly, disown us? The air in my apartment felt thin. The decision was made, but the peace was gone. The war was just beginning. The 3-hour drive to my hometown felt less like a trip and more like a descent. Every mile marker we passed felt like a year peeling away from my life, stripping off the layers of the independent, healed woman I'd become, and leaving the raw, exposed nerves of the girl who used to hide in her closet when she heard a car pull into the driveway. Sarah was driving, her knuckles white against the steering wheel, the radio off. The silence in the car wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, vibrating with all the things we weren't saying. We crossed the county line just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the fields. It's funny how a place can look exactly the same while everything inside you has shifted. There was the diner where we used to get milkshakes after school. There was the library where I'd spend hours just to avoid going home. It all looked so small, so ordinary. It was hard to reconcile these mundane landmarks with the tectonic shift happening in our lives. We checked into the Marriott under Sarah's name. The lobby was bright, clinical, and filled with the generic scent of industrial cleaner and cheap coffee. It felt safe. It was a neutral ground, a place where my father's influence didn't reach. But as we rode the elevator up to the 4th floor, the reality of what we were doing started to settle in. We weren't just here for a funeral. We were here to confront a ghost who was very much alive. In the hotel room, the tension finally snapped. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, her head in her hands, and just started to sob. It wasn't the loud, dramatic crying you see in movies. It was that quiet, shuddering release of someone who has been holding their breath for a week. I sat next to her, putting my arm around her shoulders, feeling the tremors racking her frame. "I'm so scared," she whispered into her palms. "What if he makes us leave? What if he says something horrible in front of everyone? Everyone already thinks we're the bad ones for not being around. This is just going to prove them right, isn't it?" "We aren't the bad ones, Sarah," I said, though my own voice lacked conviction. "He's the one who didn't call. He's the one who excluded us. If anyone looks bad, it's him. We're just here to say goodbye to our grandmother. That is a basic human right." But I knew she was right to be afraid. In a small town, in a tight-knit family, the narrative is everything. And for 5 years, my father had been the only one telling the story. To the aunts, the cousins, the family friends, I was the daughter who abandoned her father. I was the one who was too sensitive, the one who couldn't move on. They didn't see the bruising words or the psychological warfare. They only saw the empty chair at Thanksgiving. By showing up now, we were walking into a room where the jury had already reached a verdict. Friday morning arrived with a cruel, mocking brightness. The sun was streaming through the hotel curtains, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. I spent an hour on my makeup, not because I wanted to look beautiful, but because I needed a mask. I applied the foundation like it was war paint. I lined my eyes with a precision that felt like armor. If I was going to face him, I couldn't look like the broken girl he remembered. I needed to look like someone he couldn't touch. I put on the black dress. It fit perfectly, but it felt heavy, like it was made of lead. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. My eyes looked older than they should. There was a hardness in my jaw that I hadn't noticed before. "Ready?" Sarah asked. She was wearing a simple black suit, her hair pulled back in a tight, sensible bun. She looked like she was going to a business meeting, which I knew was her way of coping. Treat it like a transaction, not an emotion. "Ready," I lied. The drive to the funeral home took 10 minutes. Every turn was familiar. Every street corner held a memory. When we finally pulled into the parking lot, my heart did a strange, painful somersault. There it was. The long, low building with the manicured bushes and the discreet signage. And there, parked right in the front row, was my father's silver truck. Seeing it felt like a physical blow to the stomach. It was a tangible reminder that he was here. He was inside. He was probably standing near the door, shaking hands, playing the role of the grieving son, the pillar of the community. We sat in the car for a long time. Other cars were pulling in. I saw my Aunt Brenda get out of a blue SUV. She looked older, her hair grayer than I remembered. She was wearing a heavy black coat, her face set in a somber expression. She didn't look toward our car. Why would she? She didn't even know we were there. "We can still leave," Sarah said, her hand on the door handle. "We could just go to the cemetery later, when everyone is gone. We could say our goodbyes in private." I looked at the funeral home. I thought about the 7 days of silence. I thought about the obituary that didn't have our names on it. I thought about Nana, who always told us to stand up straight and never let anyone make us feel small. "No," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "If we leave now, he wins. He gets to keep the secret. He gets to pretend we didn't care enough to show up. We're going in." We stepped out of the car. The air was crisp, smelling of autumn leaves and damp earth. As we walked toward the entrance, I felt like I was moving through water. Everything was slow, distorted. The heavy glass doors of the funeral home loomed ahead of us. We stepped inside, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was exactly as I remembered. Lilies and floor wax. A cloying, sweet scent that sticks to the back of your throat. The lobby was hushed, the thick carpet muffling our footsteps. A soft, instrumental version of some hymn was playing over the speakers. A young man in the dark suit approached us, holding a stack of memorial programs. He offered us a sympathetic smile, the kind they teach you in mortuary school. "Are you here for the Miller service?" he asked softly. "Yes," I said. He handed us 2 programs. I looked down at mine. There was Nana's face again, in loving memory. I turned the page to the Survived By section. My eyes scanned the names. My father's name was there. My aunt's names were there. Even my cousins' names, some of whom she hadn't seen in a decade, were listed. But there, in the space where our names should have been, was nothing. Just a blank white margin. My hand started to shake. "The family is receiving guests in the chapel to the left," the young man said, gesturing toward a set of double doors. I looked at Sarah. She was staring at the program too, her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked at me, and for a second, I saw the little girl who used to hide behind me. But then she squared her shoulders. She took a deep breath, reached out, and pushed the doors open. The chapel was filled with people. The pews were mostly full, a sea of black coats and hushed whispers. At the very front of the room was the casket, surrounded by more flowers than I'd ever seen in one place. White roses, lilies, carnations. It looked like a garden had exploded. And there, standing right next to the casket, was my father. He was leaning over, talking to a man I didn't recognize. He was wearing a dark suit that looked expensive. He looked composed. He looked in control. He looked exactly like the man who had haunted my dreams for 5 years. As if he felt the shift in the air, he looked up. His gaze swept over the room, disinterested and practiced, until it landed on the back of the chapel. Until it landed on us. I watched the recognition hit him. It wasn't a look of joy. It wasn't even a look of shock. It was a look of pure, unadulterated coldness. His eyes narrowed, and for a split second, the mask of the grieving son slipped, revealing the predator beneath. He didn't move. He didn't wave. He just stared at us, his jaw tightening as if he were calculating exactly how much damage we were about to do to his carefully constructed day. The room seemed to go silent. I don't know if anyone else noticed the tension, but to me, it felt like a thunderclap. We were in the room. The silence was broken, and now there was no turning back. Walking down that center aisle felt like walking the plank. The chapel was long, the ceiling high and vaulted, which only served to amplify every sound. The rustle of a coat, the sniffle of a stranger, the heavy, rhythmic thud-thud of my own heart in my ears. I felt like a ghost who had walked back into the living world, only to find that the living had already rearranged the furniture and replaced my photos. I could feel the eyes. People who had known me since I was a toddler, neighbors who had seen me play in Nana's backyard, cousins I'd shared summer vacations with. They all turned their heads. Their expressions were a kaleidoscope of discomfort. Some looked surprised, some looked pitying, but most of them looked like they'd just seen something they weren't supposed to see. Like we were an unsightly blemish on a perfectly curated funeral. We passed Aunt Brenda's pew about halfway down. She caught my eye, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of something that looked like guilt. She quickly looked away, adjusting the veil of her hat, focusing intently on the floral arrangement to her left. That was the confirmation I needed. She knew. They all knew. They had all been part of the silent pact to keep us in the dark. It wasn't just my father. It was the whole structure. They had built a wall of silence, and we were the only ones who didn't have the bricks. Sarah was walking slightly ahead of me, her head held high, but I could see the way her shoulders were trembling. She was terrified, but she was brave. She was always the brave one, even when she didn't believe she was. As we approached the front, the distance between us and my father narrowed. 10 feet, 8 feet, 5. He didn't move an inch. He stood there, his hands clasped in front of him, leaning slightly toward the person he was talking to, some local politician or business associate he wanted to impress. He was performing. He was the grieving eldest son, the man of the hour, the one everyone was there to console. He was thriving in the attention, his face a mask of dignified sorrow. Then he turned. He didn't say anything. He didn't even acknowledge us with a nod. He simply stepped to the side, blocking the direct path to the casket, forcing us to go around him if we wanted to see her. It was a subtle, petty move, a gatekeeper asserting his territory. It was his way of saying, "You're here, but you're not welcome. This is my house. This is my mother. You are an intruder." Sarah stopped. She looked to him, her eyes pleading for a moment of humanity, a shred of the fatherly love that had been absent for so long. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft organ music. He didn't look at her. He looked right through her, his eyes cold and empty as two stones at the bottom of a frozen lake. "The guest book is in the lobby," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "If you're here to pay your respects, do it quietly and then leave. This is a day for family." The word family felt like a slap. I felt the heat rising in my neck, the rage, the 5 years of suppressed hurt, the indignity of being excluded from our own grandmother's death. It all came rushing to the surface. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand why. Why didn't you call us? Why weren't we in the obituary? Why are you acting like we're strangers? But I looked around the room. I saw the faces of the mourners, the solemnity of the occasion. If I made a scene, I was giving him exactly what he wanted. I would be the crazy, dramatic daughter he'd been telling everyone about. I would prove his narrative right. I reached out and took Sarah's hand. Her skin was ice cold. "Come on," I whispered. We walked around him. He didn't move to make it easy, forcing me to brush against his sleeve as I passed. I felt a jolt of electricity, a visceral reaction to his proximity that made my skin crawl. It was the same feeling I used to get when I'd hear his key in the front door. It was the feeling of being hunted. And then I saw her. Nana looked so small in that large mahogany casket. They had dressed her in a pale blue suit she'd worn to my high school graduation. Her hair was done perfectly, her hands crossed over her chest, holding a set of pearl rosary beads. She looked peaceful, but she also looked fundamentally different. The spark was gone. The woman who had told me I was smarter than I looked, and who had always kept a stash of ginger snaps in her purse, was gone. The reality of it hit me with the force of a tidal wave. All the anger at my father, all the anxiety about the funeral, all the frustration about the obituary, it all vanished, replaced by a raw, hollow grief. My grandmother was dead, truly, finally dead, and I had missed her last week on this earth. I had missed the chance to hold her hand while she was still warm. I had missed the chance to tell her that I'd finally found a job I liked, that I was finally happy. I leaned over the casket, the scent of the lilies becoming overwhelming. I didn't care who was watching. I didn't care about the man standing 2 feet behind me, radiating malice. I just looked at her. "I'm sorry, Nana," I whispered. "I'm so sorry we weren't here." Sarah was next to me, her face buried in her hands, her sobs finally breaking through the silence of the chapel. It was a heartbreaking sound, the sound of a granddaughter saying goodbye to the only person who had ever made her feel safe in this family. For a few minutes, the world outside that casket didn't exist. There was no father, no aunts, no judgmental cousins. There was just us and the woman who had loved us when no one else did. I reached out and touched the edge of the casket, the wood cool and smooth under my fingertips. I felt a strange sense of finality. This was the end of the road. Once she was in the ground, the last thread connecting us to this side of the family would be severed. But as I stood there, I felt a shadow fall over us. "That's enough," a voice said. It wasn't my father, it was Aunt Brenda. She had stood up and walked over, her face set in a hard, uncompromising line. "You've had your moment. You're upsetting the other guests. People are trying to mourn in peace." I turned to look at her, my eyes stinging with tears. Upsetting the guests? Brenda, we're her grandchildren. We didn't even know she was dead until 2 days ago. How can you say that to us?" Brenda's eyes flickered toward my father, who was watching the exchange with a calculated indifference. "You made your choices years ago," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You turned your back on this family. You can't expect to just waltz back in when it's convenient for you and act like you belong. You haven't earned the right to be here." "Earned the right?" Sarah gasped, her face red from crying. "To say goodbye to our grandmother? Are you serious?" "Lower your voice," Brenda hissed, her eyes darting around the room. "Have some respect for the dead, if you can't have any for the living." I felt a cold, hard knot of realization form in my stomach. This wasn't just my father's doing. This was a collective decision. They had all agreed that we were no longer family. They had all decided that our presence was a disturbance. They weren't mourning Nana. They were protecting their own comfort. They were protecting the lie that they were a perfect, unified family, and we were the cracks in the foundation they wanted to plaster over. I looked at my father. He was staring at me, a small, almost imperceptible smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He was enjoying this. He was watching his sister do his dirty work, watching us be humiliated in the one place we should have been welcomed. I felt a surge of strength I didn't know I had. I wiped my eyes, squared my shoulders, and looked Brenda right in the face. "We aren't leaving until the service is over," I said, my voice clear and steady. "And if you want us gone, you're going to have to call the police and have us dragged out in front of all these people. Is that the kind of funeral you want for your mother, Brenda? Do you want Family Feud to be the headline in tomorrow's paper?" Brenda blanched. She looked at my father, but he didn't offer any help. He just turned back to his conversation, leaving her to deal with the mess. She huffed, a sound of pure indignation, and marched back to her pew. We didn't leave. We sat in the very back row, the furthest point from the casket, and the furthest point from the man who called himself our father. We sat there through the hymns, through the eulogies that painted Nana as a woman who valued family above all else, an irony that felt like a knife in the ribs, and through the closing prayers. But as the service ended and the pallbearers stepped forward to lift the casket, I realized that the hardest part wasn't over. The burial was next, the cemetery, the place where the finality of it all would be sealed. And as we stood to follow the procession out, I saw my father lean over and whisper something into the ear of the funeral director. The man looked at us, then nodded solemnly. I didn't know what he said, but I knew it wasn't good. The air felt heavy again, charged with a new kind of tension. We were going to the cemetery, but I had a sinking feeling that the gates were about to be closed. The motorcade to the cemetery felt like a slow-motion funeral for my own childhood. We were at the very back of the line, a long string of cars winding through the familiar streets of our hometown like a black ribbon. I watched the people on the sidewalks pause and take off their hats as we passed, a gesture of respect for a grief they didn't know was fractured and hollowed out from the inside. They saw a family in mourning. I saw a line of cars filled with people who had spent the last week pretending I didn't exist. The cemetery was on the outskirts of town, a sprawling landscape of weathered granite and weeping willows. The air was colder here, the wind whipping across the open grass with a bite that felt personal. As we pulled through the iron gates, I saw the green canopy already set up over the open grave. It looked like a small, lonely island in a sea of gray headstones. We parked near the edge of the gravel path. Sarah didn't get out right away. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the canopy. "They're going to do something," she whispered. "I can feel it. He's not done." "It doesn't matter," I said, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "We're here for her, not for him." As we walked toward the gravesite, the funeral director, the same man my father had whispered to, stepped forward. He intercepted us about 20 yards from the canopy. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from side to side, his eyes darting toward my father, who was already seated in the front row under the tent, surrounded by Brenda and the rest of the inner circle. "I'm very sorry," the director said, his voice low and practiced, but the family has requested that the graveside service be kept to immediate family only. I felt the blood drain from my face. We are immediate family, I said, my voice rising. We are her granddaughters. The man sighed, a sound of genuine pity. I understand that, miss. Truly, I do. But I have to follow the instructions of the person who signed the contract. Your father has specified who is allowed under the canopy and who is not. I'm afraid I have to ask you to remain back here, by the path. I looked past him. My father was sitting there, his back to us, perfectly still. He knew exactly what was happening. He had choreographed this moment with the precision of a stage director. He wanted us to be there, but he wanted us to be spectators. He wanted us to watch from the sidelines while he claimed the role of the sole mourner. It was the ultimate exclusion, a public declaration that we were outsiders in our own lineage. Sarah let out a small, broken sound. She looked like she'd been punched. He's really doing this, she breathed. He's really kicking us out of the burial. No, I said, a cold, hard clarity settling over me. He's not kicking us out. He's just showing everyone exactly who he is. I didn't argue with the funeral director. There was no point. He was just a man doing a job, caught in the crossfire of a decades-old war. Instead, I grabbed Sarah's hand and led her to a spot about 30 feet away, under a large oak tree. It was far enough to be outside their circle, but close enough that we could hear the murmur of the priest's voice and see the casket as it was positioned over the earth. We stood there, two black figures against the backdrop of the gray sky, while the real family took their places. I watched as the service began. I watched my father stand and deliver a reading, his voice carrying on the wind, smooth, rhythmic, and utterly devoid of the venom I knew he possessed. He spoke of the bonds of blood and the legacy of love Nana had left behind. The hypocrisy was so thick I could almost taste it. It tasted like ash. I looked at the people under the canopy. My cousins, my aunts, the family friends. Not one of them looked back at us. They kept their heads bowed, their eyes fixed on the ground or the casket. It was a masterpiece of collective denial. They were all participating in the erasure. They were all complicit in the lie that a family can simply cut out the pieces it doesn't like and still call itself whole. And that's when it hit me. For 5 years, I had been running from this. I had been hiding, building walls, trying to heal in a vacuum. I had been so afraid of his power to hurt me that I had let him define the terms of our separation. But standing there, under that oak tree, watching him perform for a crowd of people who were too afraid to look at the truth, I realized that he didn't have any power over me anymore. The fear was gone. In its place was a profound, bone-deep realization. I didn't want to be under that canopy. I didn't want to be part of a family that used silence as a weapon. I didn't want to be included in a legacy built on exclusion. I didn't want to be recognized by a man who didn't know the first thing about love or sacrifice or even basic human decency. He hadn't excluded us from the funeral. He had set us free. I looked at Sarah. Her face was wet with tears, but she was watching the service with a strange kind of intensity. She wasn't looking at Dad. She was looking at the casket. She was saying her own goodbye, in her own way, in her own space. Sarah, I whispered. She turned to me, her eyes red-rimmed. We don't need to be over there, I said. Nana isn't under that tent. She isn't in that box. She's in every memory we have that he can't touch. She's in the way you laugh and the way I draw. She's in the fact that we're standing here together, even after everything he did to try and drive us apart. Sarah wiped her eyes, a small, tremulous smile touching her lips. You're right, she said. She'd hate this. She'd hate the drama. She'd probably tell him to stop being so pompous and give us a chair. We both let out a small, choked laugh. It was the first moment of genuine light in a very dark week. The service ended. The priest finished his prayers, and the guests began to file out from under the canopy. They walked past us, some of them offering quick, nervous nods, others looking straight ahead as if we were part of the landscape. My father was the last to leave. He walked slowly, leaning on a cane he didn't actually need, another prop for his performance. As he reached the edge of the canopy, he stopped. He looked over at us, standing under the oak tree. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. The space between us was only 30 feet, but it felt like an ocean. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me cry or seeing me angry. I just stood there, my hand in Sarah's, and looked him in the eye. He saw it. I know he did. He saw that the weapon he'd been using for 20 years had finally lost its edge. He saw that he couldn't make me feel small anymore. He saw that by excluding me, he had lost his last tether to me. His jaw tightened. He didn't say a word. He just turned and walked toward his silver truck, his shoulders stiff, his pace quickening. He didn't look back. We waited until every car had left. We waited until the cemetery was silent again, save for the wind and the distant caw of a crow. Then, we walked back to the grave. The workers were waiting at a distance, giving us a few moments of privacy before they finished their job. The flowers were piled high, their scent sweet and heavy in the cold air. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small, dried sunflower, one I'd kept from a bouquet Nana had given me years ago. I laid it on top of the mahogany lid. "Goodbye, Nana," I said softly. "Thank you for everything." Sarah took off a small silver bracelet, one Nana had given her for her 16th birthday, and tucked it into the floral arrangements. "We're okay, Nana," she whispered. "We've got each other. You don't have to worry about us anymore." As we walked back to the car, the sun finally broke through the gray clouds, casting a pale golden light over the headstones. The weight that had been sitting on my chest since Sarah first showed me that Facebook post was gone. I felt lighter. I felt older, yes, but I also felt certain. The drive home was different. We didn't talk about the father we had lost. We talked about the grandmother we had loved. We shared stories about the burnt cookies, the peppermint candies, and the way she used to hum when she was gardening. We reclaimed the narrative. We took back the memories. When I finally pulled into my own driveway that evening, the world looked the same, but I knew I was different. I had faced the monster in the dark, and I had found out that he was just a man, a small, lonely man who used silence because he was afraid of the truth. I'm still no contact. I always will be. But now, it's not because I'm hiding. It's because I've realized that there's no room for that kind of darkness in the life I've built. Nana is gone, but the lessons she taught me about strength, about resilience, and about the power of standing your ground are more alive than ever. In the end, he didn't get to bury us. He only buried the last part of himself that we ever cared about. But now I want to ask you, have you ever been in a situation where family felt like a battlefield? How do you deal with people who try to gatekeep your own grief? Have you ever had to choose between your peace and a final goodbye? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories of how you found your way through the silence. And if this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing for more real-life accounts of navigating the hardest parts